Well, good morning for all of you joining us. We are just giving all of our attendees just a few moments to hop on this morning before we get started. Just a couple of housekeeping items for you. We are recording this session as well as live on YouTube. So welcome all of you that are joining us either through Zoom or on YouTube. And we will make sure you have a recording of this session out to you before the end of the afternoon. No slides for this one, no official slides. I will have just a few little things to share on slides, but nothing that would be of benefit or importance to y'all. But we will get the recording out to you later this afternoon. We're just going to give everybody about 60 or so seconds to hop on, and we will get started in just a moment. While we are waiting, just a couple of extra logistical items. You do have a couple of functionalities available on Zoom to interact with Branche, Monique, or myself. You have your chat window. Feel free to, if you've got questions you want to post or just have a question for us, let us know. We also have an official Q&A box. If you want to submit those anonymously, you can do so in that Q&A box. We will get to your questions as we go through the next 60 minutes or so. Depending upon how the conversation goes, we'll weave them in or have them at the end. So feel free to ask your questions as we get rolling. Okay, we're about 3 minutes after the hour, so we'll get started here. Good morning or good afternoon if you're joining us from the East Coast. Maybe we've got some California attendees that happen to not be in the state. You never know these days. We just want to welcome you in. My name is Michael Barber, and I'm the host and content producer for Charter School Capital. Today, I'm joined by two guests, Monique Ramos from California Strategies and Branche Jones from the Branche Jones lobbying firm. We've invited them in for discussion on all things related to Governor Newsom's 2223 budget and California legislative updates that may impact charter schools around the state. And I would advise you, you've got some major brain power in the room to pick their brains on anything California policy or legislative related information. Now, over the course of the next hour, I'm going to introduce these two fine individuals to you all, and then I'll turn it over to them, to Monique and Branche, for their discussion and for perspectives. We'd encourage you to ask all of your questions using the Q&A window on your Zoom dialogue there. We'll do our best to get to those questions along the way. Also, we are recording this webinar, and you'll receive that recording later this afternoon. Again, no official slides other than this title slide, so we're not going to send out any official slides, but we just have a couple of things to review for you. Before I introduce Branche and Monique, allow me just a few moments to introduce Charter School Capital. Our mission is to help you get where you're going. We do that by accessing both public and private funds so that charter leaders have a consistent stream of money and other resources to help their charter schools become forever schools. For almost 15 years, we've done that through providing facilities financing, including our no-cost bond option, enrollment marketing, which helps retain your current students, attract new students, and build your school's brand in the community that it serves. We've also developed an incredible array of resources available for charter school leaders on our website, including this webinar, which happens to be our 73rd webinar over the course of the last 10 or so years. You'll find all of those webinars, in-depth ebooks, and one-sheet resources on our website at charterschoolcapital.com. I also want to mention that we are heading to the California Charter Schools Conference in 2 weeks. Super excited to be back. I've been fortunate to work with the team at Charter School Capital for over a decade and attended many a CCSA event, and look forward to seeing all your smiling faces there. We are having 2 sessions on site in Long Beach. You can see their titles and information and location and times right in front of you. We're bringing our enrollment marketing team to do an enrollment 101, enrollment marketing 101 session. That'll be on Tuesday from 12:30 to 1 p.m. in the Solutions Sessions area. And we're bringing our team, our business services team, to talk about how you can avoid fumbled audits. That'll be on Thursday from 8:30 to 9:45. You will also find us in the exhibit hall at booth 1418. And if you have never visited our booth before, we are known for our We Love Charter School socks that are displayed right in front of you. We are shipping 1,000 pairs of these bad boys to Long Beach. So we would encourage all of you to come by and grab your socks. They're always a hit with the team in California. So please feel free to come by and grab your pair of socks. So with all of the housekeeping logistical items out of the way, let me just introduce the two fine individuals in front of you today. I'll start with Monique. Monique provides California Strategies and Advocacy's client strategic insights regarding the state budget and the legislative process, as well as specialized policy expertise. Previously, Monique served as the Director of Government Affairs Division under State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tom Torlakson. In that role, she managed the Superintendent and Department of Education's Government Affairs portfolio for 5 years, including the state budget strategy, advocacy, and testimony in budget committee and subcommittee proceedings. Also joining us is a friend of Charter School Capital's, our own Branche Jones. Branche is a Sacramento-based lobbyist and political consultant who manages his own lobbying consulting firm in downtown Sacramento. He has worked in the California state legislature and on numerous political campaigns throughout the state. Before starting his own firm, he lobbied for the San Francisco Unified School District and served for 7 years as the Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the California Charter Schools Association, where he handled all legislative and political issues in California and Washington, D.C. So without further ado, you two, I'm going to turn off my video and let you two take it from here. I'll also just say we have live captions going on, so if you need to turn off the audio and just listen, captions are there for you. Branche and Monique, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate the introduction. Happy to see everybody virtually and be able to talk to you about the legislative process and what's going on in Sacramento and the budget process as well. We'll start and we'll give you just a little background on kind of where we are in the state and how we got here. I'll do a piece on legislation that's important to your interests, and then Monique will do a piece on the budget. We'll both kind of jump in and talk about both subjects, but then we'll take questions after that. We've tried to point out some highlights in the interest of time, both legislatively and in the budget, but feel free to throw any questions, which we'll take at the end out there. If you feel like we missed something or you need more information, feel free to ask and we'll try to address it to the best of our abilities or follow up with you if we can. Just in terms of politically, this is kind of an unprecedented time in California. Monique and myself have been around for a while and seen a lot of stuff in the state legislature and the administration and different state agencies. And we've been through a recall before, but I don't think we've ever been through a recall followed by an election during the redistricting process, which is what we have going on now. I think we're up to about 22 assembly members that have resigned or retiring or running for Congress, and that's out of 80. So the turnover next year is going to be incredible. I think my understanding is there'll be a few more folks that decide to exit for one reason or another. Important to you, you all know this, but chair of both education committees in the Assembly and Senate are leaving, Patrick O'Donnell and Connie Leyva, respectively. And you've dealt with them and you've heard from them in many formats, especially Mr. O'Donnell on many pieces of legislation. So you can take that as you will, but it'll be a new day in 2023. And it gives us charter school advocates and supporters new folks to talk to and reach out to in the legislature. And I think that's important. So I would implore you to, talk to the new members that are going to be coming in, talk to people who are running, but also as we get signs of who will take over those chairmanships, we'll let you know. You should reach out to them, make sure they understand your school, make sure they understand your programs. And as always, talk to legislators and local officials that represent you. I don't know, Monique, did you want to add anything to that politically?
I think the only thing I would add is on top of this huge turnover of folks leaving this year, we're also seeing a large amount of members terming out in the Senate and in the Assembly in 2024. So we're going to have, the Senate's halfway turning over by the end of, by 2025, essentially, we'll see new members. And we're losing, originally we were slated to lose a third of the Assembly, which is pretty huge considering the stability we've had over the last 12 years due to the changes in California term limits law. So that coupled with both the speaker and the pro tem, by 24, essentially we'll have new leadership due to term limits. So I think it's really shifting what California politics is looking like over the next 2-3 years.
Yeah, I think the last time we saw anything close to this is when term limits came into
Yeah.
effect, and it took a long time to kind of explain to folks what charter schools were and what the impact on charter schools were with some of the policies they were recommending and presenting and putting forward. So that's kind of a background. And I think the only other thing I'd add is, looking at just overall looking at the governor's budget proposal and talking to his staff and the Department of Finance and legislative staff, there's kind of an understanding that this isn't the time or the year to have the charter school wars continue. And as we go through legislation, there's some legislation that impacts you and your interests, but it isn't, we don't see the broad overhaul of independent study law or cracking down on charter schools, air quotes, that we've seen in the past. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that, to be honest with you, is driven by some conversations that many of you have had and other advocates and Monique and myself with the administration. And I think that's come to fruition. So I think just in terms of the budget conversation tone and the tenor and tone of those conversations have been different this year than they have been in the past. So with that, I'll jump into just some highlights on legislation for you, and understand that we're functioning on a budget. We're functioning on a legislative matrix that's over 20 some pages long. So I didn't want to send that out to everybody and try to thumb through that. So what we've done is highlighted the bills that we believe are important, and we've kind of put those in buckets, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And then again, as I said before, if we miss something or there's something else that you've heard about or want to know about or need more information, please put that in the questions and we'll be sure to address it at the end of the presentation. The first bucket is kind of ADA declining enrollment. As you know, we've had this declining enrollment issue. When I was at San Francisco Unified, it was years ago, we had a declining enrollment issue. Like every year you have a declining enrollment issue. So it's not as big of an issue for us as it is for traditional districts, especially large urban districts. I understand the policy. I understand where they're coming from, but I don't know that they've always are crafting a proposal or solution that will address it. And you just kind of have to deal with it in reality. You just have less kids every year at some of these districts. But that being said, Mr. Marisucci has introduced AB 1607 and 1609. Senator Allen has introduced SB 579, and the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Portantino, has introduced SB 830. 1607 looks at your ADA and tries to address it by funding everyone, including charter schools, on the 3-year average. 1609 does the same thing, but it's the greater of your last 4 years. SB 579 is the greater of your last 3 years. And when that bill was introduced, it did not include charter schools. Since then, Senator Allen has amended charter schools into it. SB 830 by Mr. Portantino actually changed the definition of how we fund schools and goes with average daily membership. So it's probably the broader of all the proposals, and it's kind of it's a way to look at funding schools at a greater rate. In the governor's budget proposal, he's recommending that it's the greater of the last 2 years or the average of the last 3 years. And understand that all of this is it leads to two questions. One, how do you implement it from the Department of Education and Department of Finance's perspective, but also how do you fund it? All of these measures would end up putting greater budget pressure on either A, the Prop 98 Prop 98 pot of money, or B, the budget in total as a whole. So what we believe that this will be solved not through one of these pieces of legislation, but probably through the budget process, especially with the governor leading the charge and having it in his January budget proposal. That's probably the easiest way to do it. There's also some bills dealing with finance, AB 1614, which tries to fund schools at the national average per pupil, AB 2924, which deals with the base grant calculation. So I think you need to keep your eyes on all 6 of those bills and the governor's proposal as well. Then there's the COVID issue. which leads to AB 1993, which is proof of vaccination, SB 114, which is an additional paid sick leave, because clearly we haven't done enough sick leave in this state, so we're going to add more hours to it. SB 871, which deals with the hepatitis B requirement to enter into the 7th grade, but also deals with full vaccination of pupils. SB 1479, which is school testing and requires LEAs to have a plan for testing. So those bills are all moving. At some point they'll come together, they'll figure out a plan. They'll probably all be amended into one bill. I can't see 4 bills passing, but I think those are 4 bills that are important to you that you need to keep your eyes on. And that's in the backdrop of the governor finally alleviating the mask mandate March 11th in schools, but also just a total fight at the local level between whether you should wear a mask or not wear a mask. Many districts have refused to implement the governor's mask policy. Some teachers are in open rebellion and refusing to go into those classrooms because there's not a mask. Even with March 13th relief that the governor has put out there, some districts are saying they won't change their mask policy immediately. And I think that's LA, Unified, and San Francisco leading the charge in that regard. So I think we need to keep our eyes on that policy, on all of those bills, kind of see where they come out. But like all legislation, we need to make sure that we see where charter schools are impacted, and how we're affected, and if we're actually amended into those bills. So, Monique, did you want to add anything on legislation before I continue?
I think the only other big trend we're seeing in legislation and in budget is after school, right? There was a lot of funding last year for kind of those support wraps and after school, and they're clearly not done. So we're seeing bills on that, although most of them are a little bit vague at the moment. And we're seeing that also spilling over to budget conversation.
Yeah, I think that's very important.
Hey, Branche.
Yes.
I've got a question from the audience. I was hoping you might be able to address, because it speaks to one of the things you were just mentioning a moment ago. Is it realistic to believe that a future ADA hold harmless would also apply to non-classroom based schools?
So AB 1607, AB 1609, and SB 579 do apply to you, or excuse me, they do apply to non-classroom based charter schools. The governor's budget does not apply to non-classroom based charter schools, but in conversations we've had with finance and the administration, they are open to the idea. I think there's those within the Department of Education, State Board, and Governor's Office that are against that. In the budget subcommittee hearing, Assemblymember O'Donnell was clearly opposed to that, applying the hold harmless to non-classroom based charters. I believe it's a 50-50 shot. I believe realistically, there's 50-50 chance that it does apply to everyone, and the same chance that it's limited in nature. But the conversation is much better than it's been in the past couple of years, for instance, when they wouldn't fund growth. So I think that's a possibility. I would say one thing, and I've told a number of my clients this: be very careful of what you ask for. Because once you enter into this discussion, then, just thinking it out, you are amended into that section of law. So whatever they change or do in the future will apply to you. That's one point. The second point is you really need to ask yourself from a policy perspective, do I believe in funding for students who aren't there? Right? Because that's what we're talking about, right? If you really peel all this away, you're talking about funding for students that have left that LEA. Yeah. And as ed reform people, we have always sung the mantra that we believe money should follow the student. So not telling people to go one way or the other, but just throwing those two things out as a caveat. Did you want to add something, Monique? I think you want to say something about that?
I would just add, especially with the Portantino bill, I think the pushback we've heard is, attendance is a way of having accountability, right? And actually Department of Finance said this in a budget hearing, that is a level of accountability to ensure that, schools are getting kids to come in and participate in the education program. So this is, I think, the big discussion of the year, but I agree that I think there will be consequences to what Branche said, right? If you are putting yourselves into a larger code section, and it remains to be unseen what will happen thereafter, but that is a good caution.
Yeah. And Branche, Monique, if you could just repeat the ABs that you mentioned. There's a question from Maria just asking, what are the ABs that the charter school leader should be keeping a close eye on? If you could just list those off, that would be great.
Sure. AB 1607, AB 1609, AB 1614, AB 2924, SB 579, and SB 830. So those are kind of the ADA finance bills. Then the COVID relief bills were AB 1993, SB 114, SB 871, and SB 1479. So with that, I would just briefly mention some other individual bills that I think are important to our interests. The first one, the big one, is SB 1343 by Senator Connie Leyva, requiring all charter school employees to be in STRS and PERS. The way the bill is currently drafted, it's all new charter schools starting in 2023. The fact sheet I got from the author's office states that it's going to be all charter schools. So I have a question out to the staff asking, is it their intent to amend the bill to include all charter schools or just new charter schools? Excuse me. And I think that's important because it's a huge distinction, obviously, if you have to change your existing retirement systems. But also remember, this is something that for probably 10 years, charter schools fought for. Charter schools advocated to be part of STRS. So now you have a bill that's saying you'll be part of STRS. So the bad thing is it increases employer costs, but I do think it provides some security for your employees. And people will have to make a policy decision whether that's the right thing to do or not the right thing to do. I have clients that are in STRS. I have clients that aren't in STRS. PERS is kind of a new question. I want to see the fiscal analysis when this bill comes out. As I said, we have had some initial conversations with staff, but I think SB 1343 should definitely be on your radar screen. For those of you with facilities, AB 2232 should also be on your radar screen. It requires that all school facilities have good heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. Sounds like a good policy. I think we're all in favor of that. The question is, how will it be implemented and what does a good system mean? There's some language in there around, how they're going to determine that, but clearly there's going to be amendments to it. I think AB 2232 should stay on your radar screen because it's going to increase costs potentially to your facility. AB 2427 has some changes to the IEP. That again should stay on your radar screen because there'll be some amendments to that. And as it moves, we need to see what those changes are. AB 2638 requires that you have water and water filling stations in your school. And that would be one water station per 150 individuals. Again, sounds like great policy, but at the end of the day, we'll have to see, what the fiscal impact is on your facility, what kind of changes you have to be made to your facility. And remember, with all these pieces of legislation, the important thing is that, not being in compliance with law could lead to revocation or possible revocation. So, we don't oppose a lot of these policies per se, but we are always leery of new mandates and what they'll mean for your charter. The last bill I have down is SB 941, which allows LEAs to contract with each other to provide classroom services under certain provisions, emergencies, or you're having teachers call in sick or you can't teach a class. I think that's interesting because we've always kind of functioned in California that you've got to be part of that LEA to provide classroom instruction. And this is kind of getting away from that, which opens up a number of avenues that might be of interest to us from a positive perspective. It's by Senator Portantino, who's, again, chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and who he also has a political action committee or account opened up for a run at superintendent of public instruction in 4 years. So with that in mind, he's got a number of education bills that are on his plate, including a dyslexia bill, SB 237 from last year that's still alive. But he's venturing in kind of the education space where he hasn't heavily been before. And in fairness to him, he's been open-minded, and we've had a pretty good relationship with him and his staff. With that being said, before I turn it over to Monique, I'll say again that our bill list is over 20 pages long, so it's like a nightmare, all these bills we're tracking. We believe these are the ones of most importance to you. On top of this, there's probably about 30 bills that are spot bills. As many of you know, a spot bill is a bill that's been introduced to amend that code section of law, the education code section of law, but does not have the language in it yet. So we have those. I don't want to run through all of them, but we have those marked as well. And Charter School Capital, we usually do a blog every month or every other month, so we'll keep you updated on that through the blog on the spot bills and any changes to them. One of interest, though, is AB 2759 by Assemblymember Gray, who's a moderate from the Central Valley, who's also running for Congress, is an independent study spot bill. So that one, of all the spot bills, kind of jumped out at us because it's specifically around independent study law, though the language is not in it yet. With that, I'll turn it over to Monique. You want to talk about the budget or add anything on legislation for a little bit?
I think you definitely covered the legislation at this point. So for budget, again, much like other states, it's a banner year. We've got quite a bit of money in California. And in fact, it looks like per pupil spending is estimated to be at $15,000 for Prop 98 this year, up to $20,800, accounting for all funding sources. So it's a tremendous amount of money. I will say that everyone is projecting additional money coming in by the time we hit May revise at May 15th. What is unique this year is that California is hitting the GAN limit, which hasn't really happened in the past. So the GAN limit was set in place in the late 70s when we also adopted some of our Prop 13 reforms, and essentially it caps the budget at the 1978 levels with inflation, and basically you cannot spend more than that. So any revenue that comes in primarily at May revise will be above and beyond the GAN limit. So there are some very specific ways we can use those resources. Primarily, it is supposed to go back in tax credits, but it is not really defined what a tax credit looks like. So there could be a lot of creative funding sources coming out. We've heard things like small businesses. I've heard things like more childhood tax credits for California. But what's also unique is for every dollar you spend over the GAN limit, you have to put 40% of that into Proposition 98 and another 20 cents on the dollar in our financial reserves. So we will see more money coming into Proposition 98 at May revise. But it's under these GAN limitations, which is just, it's new, and everyone's been frankly scrambling to figure out the GAN limit. So at this point, the COLA and the cost of living adjustment for this year is 5.33%. Both Department of Finance and the Legislative Analyst Office have said they anticipate that increasing by the time we hit May revise. So we anticipate additional monies there. There are some minor reforms to independent study. I would say those are primarily for brick and mortar schools who need to move to independent study to address, really this was some relief around COVID and the policies that were adopted last year. It's nothing major, it's pretty minor and streamlining. There's a heavy emphasis on early literacy this year. So we're seeing money for $500 million for literacy coaches and early reading specialists, $200 million to create multilingual classrooms or libraries, $10 million to get books out to young children under 5, and then $2 million to identify learning disabilities, and then specifically $60 million to develop professional training around that. Really, they're trying to get an early screening for dyslexia is what the major emphasis is there. There continues to be discussion about the Expanded Learning Opportunities Grant at the Assembly Budget 2 Committee last week. We heard some tension between Mr. O'Donnell and Mr. McCarty talking about how to spend all this additional Prop 98. Assemblymember O'Donnell is very clear he would like to see base grants increased in Prop 98, whereas Assemblymember McCarty is clear he wants to see additional funding for the expanded learning opportunity programs, and really making it look more like after school, and trying to increase those. There's been a lot of pushback that the legislature has heard from the field about the money they allocated not going far enough, and it not being enough to really operate after school programs for the 9-hour day that they have envisioned. So I anticipate we will see continued pressure, particularly from the Assembly, which is why I mentioned those bills, to increase resources there. On the ongoing discussion we've been having for the past few years, we are continuing to alter special education. There's $500 million to adjust the special education funding formula. This is the same conversation we've been having for the last few years. Also some looking at the SELPA and how those allocations are going out, and better insight as to how charter schools and districts essentially are earning money for SELPAs and what that individual amount looks like for schools, which should create some transparency and supports. Mental health continues to be a huge topic. There was an oversight hearing on Tuesday in the Assembly. Monday on the Assembly, about all the different elements that were in there. It continues to be a large discussion, and it's going to take a lot of time to work out because it's just pretty clear we don't really have a backbone of a system in California for huge mental health supports. We're starting to see some additional supports for IDEA Part C to B transitions, and you're seeing in this budget and an attempt really to help those younger kids through preschool programs and other programs to ensure that we're capturing those students and getting them services on the earlier end. The other big element of the budget is the implementation of TK. So the finance has basically clarified that they are long-term going to rebench Proposition 98 and embed those new students who are earning ADA into the budget. So we're seeing our first tranche of students this year. There's been quite a bit of pushback, frankly, from the field. I mean, I think the reality is, with Omicron hitting in January and February, all schools seem to be scrambling, particularly those who have not had preschool programs in the past are really struggling to try to get programs up and running. And there's still a lot of discussion about what this means and how it will be implemented. We know that some board members at LAUSD, in fact, are trying to push back and request that there's more ability to contract out and utilize the current community-based programs we have. So there is definitely money for this. There is commitment both from the administration as well as the legislature to fund this. But it is something that I think the entire education system is struggling to, frankly, get up and running next year, and will continue to be an issue, particularly with our national teacher shortage, which only seems to be growing. And then I would just say we should continue to watch the changes to nutrition for those of you who operate nutrition programs. Last year, we adopted universal meals programs, but finance is really attempting to recoup as much of those federal funds as possible. And for those schools who weren't already utilizing the community eligibility provisions, you will now be required to in order to recap as much money as possible. Then lastly, there's $1.5 billion in a 4-year career pathway grants dollars. we see throughout the entire budget, both higher education, so community college, CSU, and UC, a real linkage to workforce in college to career pathways. A particular emphasis is we could imagine in the healthcare sector, and also I would say community health, social workers, elements like that, just recognizing the burnout in the number of staff we need in order to further implement some of the changes that California has suggested. Branche, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good overview. The only thing I'd add is, as we watch these budget subcommittee hearings and you watch this play out and you talk to staff, different folks, the LAO, Monique said this, but they're really pushing back on the creation of new programs. It's astonishing to us the breadth of some of the programs that are proposed and the times we're in, right? And you have folks literally just trying to keep their programs open. I got a friend, we both have a friend, Brett McFadden. I saw him the other day, and he's a superintendent of a small school district up north, and he was talking about how he had to shut his school district down for a week or two when the teachers caught COVID because he just didn't have the bodies, he didn't have the subs. So and I think that's part of the tension Monique was talking about with Assemblymember O'Donnell and some other folks, and some people and Senator Mann and Laird, chair of the budget subcommittee in the Senate, is you're trying to do these new programs under just horrendous conditions in the field. And we haven't addressed, what's going on in the field appropriately first. So, the governor's May revision will come out after the administration has had an opportunity to look at tax receipts. And I fundamentally believe a lot of these new programs will be folded into existing efforts or maybe options. But Monique's description of the GAN limit creates an incredible problem for the administration because they're rolling with all this money, but they've got some limitations on what they can do with it. So,
anything else to add, you two?
Just one quick piece on the state board. There's 4 vacancies. The governor appointed a Gabriela Gonzalez, who's an elementary school teacher from Montebello Unified School District, Brenda Lewis, who was the assistant superintendent from Kern High School District and worked in Kern for a long time in the district, and Sharon Olkin, who's the executive director of Gateway Public Schools down there in San Francisco. So he's got one more appointment to make. I think many of you know Sharon and you're familiar with Gateway. So I think that's a pretty strong appointment, but we'll see who the other person who that person is that he puts on the state board. But he's going through and understand the process. They've been appointed. They can begin to serve immediately. They must be confirmed within a year of their appointment. We don't see any issues with them getting confirmed. So, those will be your new State Board of Education members.
Well, wonderful. I want to thank you both first and foremost for your expertise and perspective that you brought to the last 40 or so minutes for the webinar. We couldn't do this without experts in the field like yourself. So we deeply appreciate the time and energy both of you have brought to today's discussion. Anything else before I wrap up, Branche or Monique?
I think that's it.
Wonderful.
Take some questions. See what we missed.
I'm happy to take questions. I think we answered most as things were coming through. I think the one question we didn't answer, Branche, was related to one of the bills you mentioned. Darcy asked, does this include resource centers? I think this was speaking to, was it SB 114? I could be wrong on what she was referencing, but that was the question. Does this include resource centers?
So none of the bills, and Monique will correct me if I'm wrong, none of the bills specifically include resource centers. They all kind of, the ADA bills all deal with your funding, right? So they all deal per pupil and the students that you serve. She may have been talking about AB 2232, the heating and ventilation and air conditioning bill.
Okay.
to my recollection, and I'm going to take a quick look, I do not believe resource centers were included in there. They are not in that language.
And what about the
However,
water
let
bottle
me
filling?
but hang on, one thing.
Yeah.
So it's not specifically included in the language, but the language defines covered school, which includes a charter school. So knowing the author, Mr. McCarty, he's going to say that the intent was to include resource centers and school facilities.
And is that also on the water bottle filling station bill too, or is that only for the HVAC bill?
So again, as the previous bill, it does not define, it doesn't say resource centers, but it does say charter school.
Okay.
So, you're going to, I'm sure the author is going to make the case that the intent was to cover the facilities used by that charter school.
I would agree with that interpretation.
Okay. I'm going to make one more ask for questions, because that wraps up all the questions we got during the conversation. And I'll keep looking at that chat as I just give a few little highlights for everyone. I did want to mention, Monique, you spoke to obviously the challenges from a mental health perspective that every educator, every student, every parent, and for that matter, most of the world is dealing with at the moment. I did want to let everyone know we are gathering resources from multiple places to host a webinar on student and teacher mental health in April. So please be on the lookout for that. We haven't confirmed a date yet, but we should be letting everyone know what that'll look like in the next couple of weeks. Did want to reiterate, we do have a couple questions here before I wrap up. All right, so from Maria, do you know how this would impact sites that lease their locations from authorizers? Would charters own the financial obligations to update facilities that are leased from our authorizers?
That's a good question. Go ahead, Monique.
I don't know. I think that's a good question.
Yeah, I think you got to look at your lease. I think you have to look at your lease and see what your lease says. And I also think that each authorizer might handle that differently, depending on, what your charter with them says and what the lease says. Is it a Prop 39 facility? Is it just straight out of lease? But so that's the reality of how those bills will be implemented. Now, if I put on my old legislative staff hat, I'm just going to say, yeah, you're going to have to update everything, right? That's going to be the intent of the author who's authoring the legislation. But I think that that's something that if I were thinking this through, I would want to leave flexibility at the local level so I could deal with my authorizer and who I'm leasing from, and not have the state mandate it. Because understand, if the state mandates it specifically, they're going to say, yes, all buildings have to have all these upgrades. And but
no, I was just going to say, Maria, I will happily have Ryan Eldridge, who leads our relationships with California charter leaders, reach out. If you have any questions, we're happy to help look through that lease and help you decide what's going to be necessary if that's needed. I will make sure to pencil that and let him know that you had that question. We're more than happy to provide some advice if needed.
I'll just also say, requiring ACs in all school districts and all charter schools is going to be incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
So I can't see this happening without some money, because having spent a long time in facility space, this is just it's a huge price tag. So this may not be a this year proposal that makes it through.
Yeah, and that's something that we should have said in the beginning, is that all these are proposed pieces of legislation. So they're not at the final stage. To Monique's point, most if not all of these bills will end up having to go through the Appropriations Committee in both houses, the Assembly and the Senate, and will probably get hung up there on funding. Because, part of having all this money and figuring out how to get it out the door is, how do you get it out the door on one-time expenditures versus ongoing costs? And once you make some of these major policy changes, you create what we call budget pressure on Prop 98, right? You create ongoing costs that the state is going to have to expend. So as I was kind of joking when I talked about some of the bills, they're all great ideas, because we love great ideas, but they're just not all feasible at the local level.
For sure. Thanks for that clarification. Okay. that is all the questions. So I'm going to give everyone 15 minutes back to their day. And just remind everyone, we will be in Long Beach in 2 weeks. Would love to see you there with 2 sessions on enrollment marketing and how to handle audits throughout your year. Again, we recorded this session. That'll be out to you later this afternoon. And I'll wrap it up by just saying thank you again to Monique and Branche for the expertise and the perspective. It was clearly valuable. We had almost 65% of everyone that registered show up and stick with us for 45 minutes, which is a great result and we appreciate both of your time. And I hope to have you back just after the May revision and we can continue this conversation again.
All right. Thanks for attending, everybody. Appreciate it. Michael, thank you. Monique, thank you.
Thank you both and everyone else.